Good morning, students. I hope every one of you are fine and taking care of yourself. Children, today we are going to start a new lesson from Science 2. It is lesson number 3, Life Processes in Living Organism, Part 2. So, children, let's begin. So, in today's lecture, we will be studying Science Part 2, Lesson number 3, Life Processes in Living Organism, Part 2. First of all, what is reproduction? Now, children, reproduction is defined as a biological process in which an organism gives rise to another young one, that is, its offspring, similar to itself. Okay, now this offspring, it grows, matures, and in turn it produces a new offspring. So basically there is a cycle of birth, growth and death. It enables the continuity of the species. Okay, it continues the generation of the species from generation to generation. Okay, now there are two types of reproduction: asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Now, what is asexual reproduction? It involves only one parent and the offspring genetically is identical to the parent. It involves regular cells and it is a quick process. Okay, now what is sexual reproduction? It involves two parents and the offspring genetically mix both the parents. It involves specialized sex cells and it is a slow process. So this is the difference between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Now the types of asexual reproduction are fishing, fragmentation, budding, vegetative propagation, regeneration and spore formation. So children, we are going to learn each one of this in detail. So let us begin the first one. We will first see the asexual reproduction in unicellular organism. That is, first one is binary fission. Now here children, we will take an example of amoeba. Now look at this picture carefully. Here in this process, the parent cell divides to form two similar daughter cells. Okay, here the nucleus is dividing, the cytoplasm is also dividing. And this binary fission occurs either by mitosis or amitosis. Now amoeba divides in many daughter cells. Okay, now hence it is called as a simple binary fission. Now look here, paramecium. Now this paramecium, it divides transversely. Okay, so it is called as transversal binary fission. Okay, are you getting me? Now let's see the next one. This is called as euglena. Okay, now here euglena, it divides longitudinally. Okay, so the nucleus, flagellum all divides longitudinally, hence it is called as longitudinal binary fission. Now let us see the multiple fission in unicellular organism. Asexual reproduction by multiple fission is performed by amoeba, plasmodium and other similar protists. Now here what happens is it becomes round and form protective covering around the plasma membrane. Such encysted protists are called as cyst. Now many nuclei are formed by repeated nuclear division in the cyst. They remain encysted till the adverse condition. Then the cyst breaks open on the arrival of favorable condition and many such nuclei are released and they live independently when there is availability of abundant food material. So, now the next type is budding. Now let's see an example of yeast cell. The yeast cell performing budding, that is a small bud coming out of many parent cells. Asexual reproduction occurs by budding in yeast. Yeast cell produces two daughter nuclei by mitotic division so as to reproduce by budding. A small bulge appears on the surface of the parent cell. This bulge is actually a bud. One of the two daughter cell nuclei enters this bud. After sufficient growth, bud separates from the parent cell and starts to live independently as a daughter yeast cell. Now let us see the asexual reproduction in multicellular organism. The first one is fragmentation. This type of asexual reproduction occurs in multicellular organism. In this type of reproduction, the body of parent organism breaks up into many fragments and each fragment starts to live as independent new organism. This type of reproduction occurs in algae like Spirogyra and sponges like Cycon. Okay, second is regeneration. You may know that the wall lizard breaks up and discards some of its tail in emergency, isn't it? The discarded part is regenerated after a period. This is an example of limited regeneration. However, under certain situations, an animal like planaria breaks up its body into parts and therefore each part regenerates remaining part of the body and thus two new planaria are formed. Next we have budding. Here in case of hydra, under favorable condition at specific part of its body, an outgrowth is formed by repetitive division of regenerative cells of body wall. This outgrowth is called as bud. Budding hydra separates from the plant hydra and starts to lead an independent life when it grows up and becomes able to lead an independent life. Here the parent hydra supplies nutrition. Then next we have the spore formation. Now fungi like mucor have filamentous body. They have sporangia. Now what happens, children? When the spores are formed, sporangia burst and the spores are released. Okay, now when the spores are released, then spores germinate in moist and warm places. Now once this spores gets the favorable condition, that means it germinates in moist and warm places, so new fungal colonies develop. Next is vegetative propagation or reproduction. Vegetative reproduction is any form of asexual reproduction occurring plants. Okay, now here there are different types of vegetative propagation: cutting, layering, grafting and plant tissue culture. So now we will learn sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Now sexual reproduction in plants. Here we will learn how sexual reproduction takes place in flowering plants. So, let's begin, children. It is the spring season here, isn't it? Flowers are blooming on the trees. It is indeed a beautiful sight. Flowers attracts all of us, isn't it, children? Flowers are the most beautiful part of the plant. You already know, children, that flowers are not present only to add beauty to the plant. They are in fact the reproductive organs of the plant, right? Now, in the flower, stamen is the male reproductive part, while the carpel is the female reproductive part of the flower. Now, some flowers contain both male and female reproductive parts. So, such flowers are called as bisexual flowers. Okay, children. Now, some examples are like pea, China rose, and many more, etc. Now, children, some flowers possesses either male or the female reproductive plant. So, such flowers are called as unisexual flowers. Okay, now let us know about the different parts that makes up a stamen and a carpel. Now, a stamen and a carpel. Now, let us see, children. A stamen is made up of two parts, an anther and a filament. Anther produces pollen grains. It is the pollen grain that contains the male gamete. Now, a carpel on the other hand, it is made up of three parts. Okay, the terminal part is called the stigma. The middle elongated part is the style, and the swollen bottom type is called as ovary. Now, inside the ovary, ovules are present. It is the ovule that has the female gamete called as egg cell. Now, children, for sexual reproduction to take place, a male gamete is to be fused with the female gamete, thereby forming a zygote. Now, for that, the male gamete have to reach the female gamete. For this, first, the pollen grain carrying the male gamete is transferred. The transfer of a male gamete from the stamen of a flower to the stigma of the same or other flower. This is called as pollination. Okay, such transfer of pollen grain is called as pollination. Are you getting me? Now, if the pollen grain of a flower lands on the stigma of the same flower, it is called as self-pollination. But if the pollen grains of a flower lands on the stigma of another flower of the same or other plant of the same type, it is called as cross-pollination. Now, children, pollination occurs with the help of different agents like wind, water, or animal. Now, once the pollen grain reaches the stigma of the suitable flower, so what happens? A tube grows from the pollen grain This tube travels through the style and reaches the ovary. Now what happens is the male gamete from the pollen grain travels in this tube and reaches the female gamete present in the ovule of the ovary. After that, the male and female gamete fuses together to form a zygote. This process of fusion of male and female gamete is called as fertilization. The zygote formed after the fertilization then divides several times to form an embryo inside the ovule. The ovule becomes tough and develops a tough coat and changes to a seed. The ovary, on the other hand, ripens and forms a fruit around the seed. Now, at this time, the other part of the flower, like sepals and petals, fall off. So, a seed present inside the fruit, it contains an embryo, which is actually a baby plant. Now each time a seed is planted in the soil and is provided with the appropriate condition, it grows into a seedling. Are you getting me, children? Now let us quickly summarize what we have learned today. Asexual reproduction. It is the simplest form of reproduction. It occurs in plants, simple animals, bacteria and protists. It requires only one parent. It is more reliable than sexual reproduction and doesn't allow for any type of genetic variation. Got it? Now let's see what are the types of asexual reproduction. Budding, regeneration or fragmentation, fission, that is binary fission, spores, and vegetative propagation. Now the structure of a flower. It is the organ for sexual reproduction. It has sepals, petals, stamens and carpels. Stamens and carpels are the reproductive parts of the flower which contains the germ cell. Now the transfer of pollens from male anther to female stigma is called pollination. The fusion of the male and female gamete is called as fertilization and it occurs inside the ovule. So children, with this we have finished with today's session. I hope you enjoyed the session and understood the topic. We will learn the next topic in our next session. Thank you, children.